This is the sixth lecture in our fall faculty lecture series on the university, presented by the Committee on Public Lectures. One of the most essential and cherished traditions of universities is that of academic freedom. Because of its importance to the university and to the world outside, its nature, reason for being, and limitations should be analyzed and understood by both the general public as well as the university population, even in the rain. Professor Donald B. Meyer of the UCLA Department of History will present the lecture on academic freedom, faculty and student, and answer questions in the discussion period following the lecture. Professor Meyer received his PhD at Harvard in 1953 and joined the faculty at UCLA in 1955. Recently, just this June, his book, The Positive Thinkers, was published by Doubleday, and he is also the author of numerous articles. He has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship to do research on 19th century Anglican social thought in England. At UCLA, he teaches courses in American intellectual history, and it's my pleasure to present Professor Donald Meyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on a rainy night. And I would like to associate, if not my inadequate words, then the great theme of tonight's lecture with the memory of our colleague and my friend, Professor Hans Meyerhoff, who, it seems to me, was the veriest incarnation of the high values that the tradition of academic freedom for both students and faculty is intended to nourish. It seems to me that UCLA will be blessed to know his like again. In discussing academic freedom, one standard and familiar approach is to see the issue in its relation to other powers than that of the university, notably the powers of the state. Tonight I want to follow another line within the university community itself. Perhaps if this was 1955, in particular, we have had occasion to contemplate ourselves, and I shall take this cue. As some of you may have heard from my excellent colleague and friend, Professor Richard Rouse, in the first of these series of lectures on the university, the freedom of the university had its origins in a community of scholars, teachers, and students together, and in circumstances strikingly different from those which have made for the general freedom of free men in a free society. Several scholars have emphasized the point. Academic freedom and general civic freedom of speech have not necessarily marched together hand in hand. For instance, over a long history, two of the great advances in the realm of freedom for scholarly study and teaching, academic freedom, have been in science and from religion. Linking the two, the figure of Galileo stands as a monument. But when we say today that academic freedom in the natural sciences and from the prescriptions of religion embraces a very wide field by comparison with times past, as recently as, say, 1900 in the United States, we by no means imply that this progress in academic freedom has been accompanied by a counter-progress, or a similar progress, rather, in the expansion of other liberties. I remember 15 years ago or so how a group of eminent American scholars, including notably James Conant, was engaged in the study of the fate of scientific investigation, which is to say freedom of scientific study and scholarship in totalitarian Russia, with the obvious and painful hope of discovering, or painfully obvious hope of discovering, that political inhibitions upon political freedom necessarily entailed inhibitions upon science and scientific freedom. But I'm afraid we still await the confirmation of that hypothesis. So that it seems that, contrary to a pleasant notion, freedom is not a seamless web. As President Kerr has suggested in another connection, our slavery and our freedom may advance hand in hand. If I may be excused a gross historical speculation, the thought has come to me in preparing for this lecture that the idea of academic freedom struck its deep roots in the soil of a solidarity between teacher and student. After all, in most cases, what men teach is themselves, duplicates of themselves. Perhaps the oldest and perhaps still the most widespread form of teaching is that of apprenticeship, surely the pedagogy that obtains between father and son, as well as that of craftsmen, politicians, actors, thieves, and various others. In our modern universities, doctors teach young men to be doctors, lawyers, lawyers. Architects teach young men to be architects, and so on. In the case of universities, generally scholars have taught young men to be scholars, mostly. And it was to this understanding, I think, partly, that we can assign some of the inspiration for the idea of academic freedom and some of the, after all, surprising tolerance of it on the part of authorities otherwise by no means attracted to the spread of autonomy among their subjects. This would seem to be markedly true of the case of the German universities, influential as their model has been for the modern American university. But perhaps the most intriguing case is that of English universities. In England, so far as I know, academic freedom has remained an unquestioned tradition through all the vicissitudes of 20th century history. There has been no McCarthyism. The institution of tenure, which is often said to be the keystone of academic freedom in the United States, is unknown in England. No statutes of any English universities guarantee academic freedom, with the possible exception of one statute at the University of London. Academic freedom has won no recognition at all in English jurisprudence, and yet academic freedom exists practically untroubled. But also, the proportion of English young men and women who are graduates of English universities lags far behind, not simply the rate in the United States, but the rate in France, in Germany, in Russia, and very soon possibly China, Venezuela, India, and whatnot. Many English academic men are deploring the opening efforts in England to double, treble, quadruple the numbers of English university graduates. Of course, English dons have not trained only dons, but the English universities have trained their graduates according to a model in which a certain primary style of cultivated learning is standard, whether its bearer be a university fellow, an MP, an officer in the city, a vicegerent in India. No one has pretended that the style taught in the university should be generalized, democratized, universalized throughout the society. And the novels of C.P. Snow, I think, nicely suggests the in-group atmosphere. In the United States, many, if not most, 19th century professors also trained duplicates of themselves, especially in the numerous church colleges, but also in the new state universities. But in the 20th century, and especially since 1945, who can say that there is, in the life of the university teacher himself, a guide for more than a steadily declining fraction of his students? Perhaps the point was defined once and for all with the definitive arrival of mass coeducation around World War I. Many professors can finesse direct confrontation with this simple fact. In their preoccupation, often a growing preoccupation with their graduate students. But I do not think we come to the roots of any meaningful, serious concern with academic freedom today in contemplation of academic freedom in the graduate schools, or in singling out, as it is very easy to do for professors, those of our students who inspire us because of their obvious involvement in the kind of work we do and their serious consideration of proceeding on into an academic career like ours. Here are some perhaps overly vivid impressions of some of today's students. The first is from Harold Taylor, once a president of a college, Sarah Lawrence College in New York, writing this year. He talks about the student activists returning to college. He says, "They are impatient with a society that takes its knowledge and values at second hand. As a result, they are often misunderstood by those of the older generation, especially among the educators who have not themselves had the experience of direct involvement with the situation of the world. Should," he says, "the faculty try to enter the minds of these students, they would discover how far behind they, the faculty, have fallen in understanding the nature of contemporary social change and the role of youth in bringing it about. The complacency, conservatism, and paternalism of the educators give them a reference point too far distant from the reality of the student to make informed judgment of student thought and action even remotely possible." That is to say, Taylor is pointing directly at the scene where professor is no longer remotely to be understood as training duplicates of himself. Several members of the Berkeley faculty last year carried an advertisement in various newspapers around the university-wide campus to explain how the Berkeley faculty was thinking during the crisis of last fall with reference to the students. And they said this: these young people are part of a generation which is quite different from those which, as educators, we have faced in the recent past. Many of them find themselves alienated from what they regard as a bureaucratized society and from the increasingly impersonal university through which they have their major contact with that society. They are trying to find meaning for their lives and finding it often outside the university in a commitment to the active social movements of today. To an unfortunate extent, we, their faculty, have lost touch with them. And this failure of communication inevitably affects adversely the educational process as well as the integration of the educational community. One cannot teach these young people by telling them that their social concerns are irrelevant or by attempting to deny them the activities which are often the focus of their interest as maturing adults. One might ask how many of the total student population might be described by such descriptions. A minority, certainly. In a Newsweek poll, 53% of the students queried said that if they felt strongly about a cause, they would defy school authorities, although only 22% actually had. 43% said they would go to jail, although only 3% had. 28% said they would violate the law, though only 10% had. Unfortunately, Newsweek did not ask how many had, in fact, ever felt strongly about a cause. But it hardly matters. Scholars in training scholars never worried that scholars have never numbered 10% of any population, or 5%, or even 1%. Christopher Jenks, a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, and one of the staff members responsible for the Byrne Report, has suggested some perhaps overly vivid possibilities for meeting the situation in the modern university. And I'll quote him a bit. He says, because every young American now knows he has to have a BA to become a full citizen, the campuses are crowded with students who have no desire to apprentice themselves to an academic discipline. Jenks says that such students are bright enough, but they do not regard the scholar's life as ideal or even very interesting. And yet this is what is offered to them as a model. The quest for other kinds of experience, Jenks says, leads these students in many directions, to living among the poor in a slum, to manning a picket line, to civil disobedience in jail, to drug taking, and perhaps most commonly to bed. Jenks suggests that there might be a way to involve the energy of these students in learning if conditions differed from those which now obtain in the universities. America needs a new kind of college, he says, in which the teachers are not drawn primarily from the academic profession and the pedagogy does not rely primarily on classrooms. Such a college might hire traditional sociologists and anthropologists to run a program centered on field work among one or another variety of non-students instead of merely reading reports and statistics collected by others. By creating a context in which non-academicians could play a useful role in educating undergraduates, it might do something to assuage the teacher shortage. More important, it would create a new route into middle-class adult life which did not involve the pursuit of grades, credits, and academic skills. Such an alternative would not only speak to the malaise which now grips many campuses, but might in the long run lead to the emergence of a new breed of BAs more willing to learn from experience and more engaged in the world around them. What does all this have to do with academic freedom? I think it has everything to do with it. More obviously, perhaps, with respect to the academic freedom of students, but more profoundly still with the academic freedom of professors. And let me sketch quickly some of the implications for student freedom, and then turn to the implications for academic freedom more traditionally defined, that of the faculty. American law is now beginning to recognize that in modern America, a young person does have, in fact, a stake in a college education that is more than a privilege. In 1961, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in an Alabama case declared, it requires no argument to demonstrate that education is vital and indeed basic to civilized society. Without sufficient education, the plaintiffs would not be able to earn an adequate livelihood, to enjoy life to the fullest, or to fulfill as completely as possible the duties and responsibilities of good citizens. Surely no one can question that the right to remain at the college in which the plaintiffs were students in good standing is an interest of extremely great value. It is true that, in the case of private institutions, courts have been reluctant to limit what have been construed as near absolute power on the part of the institution to dismiss students. In the case of Anthony versus Syracuse University, the court ruled against a young lady dismissed by the university for not being a typical Syracuse girl, on the ground that the university had reserved its right to dismiss for any reason it saw fit. But commentators in the New York Law Review have criticized the tradition of the courts represented in this decision of relying upon the contract between student and university entered into upon registration as a sanction for dismissal. What valid contract in fact exists? The university's absolute right to expel students under some university rules implies that the university is not bound to anything, and therefore there is no valid contract in ordinary law. In the second place, courts ordinarily ask about the freedom of the parties to a contract to enter that contract, and it is perfectly clear that a student has no effective freedom in the contract that supposedly exists between himself and the university when he registers to enter. Moreover, there are such puzzles as whether a contract binding a student as a consequence of his registration at the university should it then go on to include regulations subsequently imposed after he is already in the university, a requirement which would resemble no ordinary contracts in the past. In short, the courts have discriminated against students in this particular area of interpretation. The Byrne report, again, summed things up in general in a plain lay fashion on this whole point, in saying the development of the character and intellect of university students cannot be viewed as a one-way process. It is a two-way process in which the students give their time, their energy, and their loyalty, and the other members of the academic community give in return. University education, in other words, is not simply a privilege provided by society to those of its children who can benefit from it. This would be the old definition of the academic freedom of students, Lernfreiheit, the freedom simply to attend a class and listen to a professor lecture, and nothing more. That is being objected to here. It seems safe to suggest that in our society, it is time for all members of the university family to agree that students must enjoy rights of due process like everyone else. The principle of university regulation of student behavior has been long established in English and continental law. It is that the university, in affirmation of its own status and its own purposes, may regulate in order to defend and further its own purposes and status. Nor can it honorably, nor should it be allowed legally, to invoke claims to such regulations, such as traffic flow, to achieve some other end. This is not to say that the simple formula time, place, and manner in regulation of student activities automatically provides decisions in every hard case. No formula does, but it does indicate the substance of the justification to be asked of all regulations, a clear and demonstrable difference that is made to education. One headline asked recently, this month, in the papers, UC Enigma, will politics curb teaching? By all the law there is on the matter, universities have the plain right to see to it that teaching is not curbed by student politics, but there is no law and no history that suggests that teaching cannot proceed without curbing politics. In the past year at Berkeley, this issue has come to be refined down to the distinction between lawful and unlawful off-campus action following on-campus preparation for that action. On February 12, 1965, the chairman of the statewide Academic Freedom Committee spoke before the Assembly of the Academic Senate to this point as follows. What would we lose if we dropped the reference to unlawful off-campus action? To do so would not be to drop the power of the university to discipline or expel undesirable persons. We do not discipline for the sake of discipline or even for the sake of the law, but for the sake of the educational process. If a student is indeed doing something unlawful, let him be arrested. If he is doing something educationally disruptive, let the educational institution, the community of scholars, discipline him for educational reasons. We do not spell out the distinction between lawful and unlawful in other areas, do we? We do not say, for example, the students may plan to sell tickets for lawful off-campus parties, but not for unlawful off-campus parties. To make the explicit distinction in the one area inevitably makes it seem that we are trying to smother the civil rights movement, that we are afraid of dangerous ideas, that we are trying to placate conservative groups in the community, that we are more vigorously opposed to illegality in politics than in sex or drinking. The need, that is, to make the distinction in only one area communicates itself most unfortunately to the students and to many others. The distinction in a single area becomes, in fact, a discriminatory action by an institution that is supposed to remain neutral. The Academic Council reports that the Regent said nothing about such discipline in November, and President Kerr has many times stated his belief that the students shall not be penalized on campus for an off-campus offense of this character. This raises real problems. If no discipline is contemplated, why should we retain language that implies discipline? And if we publicly announce that no discipline is contemplated in spite of the implication, then the language seems even more to be an empty gesture aimed at misleading and placating conservative groups in the community. I do not believe that many persons seriously fear that such a policy of simply abandoning these casuistical distinctions between the lawful and the unlawful would lead American student bodies to resemble those of the University of Caracas, using the university as sanctuary for their raids upon society. Some would say that it was just this policy that issued in the filthy speech movement that came as such a dismal anticlimax to last fall's events, but I wonder if a university need be frightened by such a scarecrow. What may still operate is a much more pervasive attitude. As Robert Hutchins put it in his sardonic way, it seemed perfectly natural to most Californians to impose a special loyalty oath on the professors of the university some years ago. The majority view was that the professors were babysitters who should not be permitted to corrupt the children of the state. Now the general reaction to the demand of the students for freedom of speech is that they are juvenile delinquents. But just why should the American university retain any longer any vestige of its well-known role in America in loco parentis? Actually, for the most part, it is abandoning it. It asks for discretion and public decorum in its own precincts, including dormitories. It abstains from curiosity about private life. What would be risked in silently letting go such remaining vestiges as lockout for female students may be more vivid in minds still shaped by the imagination of a generation ago than by present practice. Anyway, it is being experimented with right now today in the Berkeley dormitories. In the United States, private colleges which wish to cater to that clientele still interested in the mingling of college and cloister remain free under our Constitution to get a charter from the state and protect the students. In short, it is difficult to see where and why the university must, in the name of its own purposes, deprive any student of any of the substance, of any of the freedom he would have if he were a 19 or 20-year-old on his own in the larger world. As the Academic Freedom Committee interpreted the Regent's statements of last fall, more specifically respecting the California Constitution's provisions for the university will maintain its traditional independence and neutrality in politics and religion, not by impartially forbidding the activities listed in the sections in the rules for students and student organizations, not by impartially forbidding activities, but by impartially allowing them. How does this link to academic freedom? How does this freedom for students, which I'm suggesting can be made absolute by simply abandoning the long and dreary tradition of distinctions between on and off-campus organizations, lawful and unlawful activities that have marked this university and so many others for the last 25 years. How does this theme link to academic freedom as more traditionally understood, that of the faculty? It links with academic freedom for the faculty because it intersects with a faculty person's interest in knowing that his security as a professional shall not be jeopardized by his life as a citizen. Some confusion tends still to cling to this point. In its earlier years, between the wars, the American Association of University Professors itself, in its statements of principle, tended to speak of academic freedom as though it were confined to professional performance and implied special restrictions upon faculty persons outside professional performance. But in 1956, it reached out to the necessary point that if a member of a faculty is endangered in his academic position because of his exercise of any constitutional right, then his academic freedom is jeopardized. In the AAUP's words, he is not required because of his profession to maintain a timorous silence as a price of professional status. In recent years, the Supreme Court has spoken against the older view that an academic post is not vested with right, but is basically simply a privilege. The leading case for the old view was a decision of Oliver Wendell Holmes when he was still a judge in Massachusetts in the 1890s, when he said, respecting the case of a police officer, that while the plaintiff might have a constitutional right to talk politics, he had no constitutional right to be a policeman. What the courts following Holmes usually neglected was that Holmes went on to add that the city could impose upon any employee reasonable restrictions, which is to say only reasonable restrictions. The point of view of the post-war Supreme Court came to be summed up in the words of Justice Clark in the 1956 case of Slockower versus New York, where he said, "To state that a person does not have a constitutional right to government employment is only to say that he must comply with reasonable, lawful, and non-discriminatory terms laid down by the public authorities." And one scholar has generalized the point: the contention that the state as employer has greater rights than the state as a political sovereign has disappeared. But the most interesting case in recent years, in several regards, is that of Assistant Professor Koch at the University of Illinois, dismissed as a consequence of the publication in the student newspaper in Urbana of an article responsive to a previous article, in which he indicated his belief that sexual intercourse before marriage, quote, should be condoned among those sufficiently mature to engage in it without social consequences and without violating their own codes of morality and ethics, unquote. What deserves note here is, first, that a faculty committee reviewing the case of his dismissal before the expiration date of his contract voted unanimously against that action, against that dismissal. That the Board of Trustees voted unanimously to uphold the dismissal. That the Board of Trustees prevailed. That, granting Koch's right to express views contrary to commonly accepted beliefs and standards, the Board of Trustees' words, without, however, citing the source of its assumption that Koch's views were so contrary to modern accepted beliefs and standards, it dismissed him on account of the tone, language, and content of his letter, which, to at least some eyes, was no more than vigorous. And finally, that the Illinois Supreme Court found no constitutional issue involved and dismissed the countersuit of Professor Koch. Although, as law professor William Murphy of the University of Missouri says, it is hard to see how the court could have failed to protect Mr. Koch from any state sanction had he been a private citizen, since his letter clearly was protected by the First Amendment. In other words, the court here failed to extend to Professor Koch the same constitutional protection that an ordinary citizen would have in the name of some undefined principle of university authority. And the authority in this case being unambiguously and nakedly that of the Board of Trustees. This is to say that while freedom in the classroom has now been nearly established in constitutional law itself, the leading case being the famous case of Sweezy versus New Hampshire, the decisive problem today is no longer that of academic freedom in the classroom, but that of the freedom of the faculty to be involved in speech and in action in affairs of the larger world without jeopardy to their faculty position. This is not to say that the classroom itself is not still threatened. C. Van Woodward has described some of the tragedy and anguish in a whole sector of the academic world today in his article 3 years ago, The Unreported Crisis in the Southern Colleges. But it is to say that the older definitions of academic freedom, including that of one of the founders of the AAUP, the revered Arthur Lovejoy, are now understood to be too narrow. Before turning to my concluding argument, let me comment briefly about the more or less measurable aspects of the present effective exercise of academic freedom as we know it. Over the last 20 years, the chief incitation of academic freedom cases has been communism in one connection or another. With the decline of McCarthyism, we tend to think the issue has passed its acute phase, and indeed it has, but mostly not because of triumphs of academic freedom, but because of the attrition, often tragic, of a generation. There are more than two sides to the old standard question, would you want your child's teacher to be one? And I suppose most of us would not. But that is beside the point here, that the record of attrition was one of scant regard for due process and of weak performance by faculty. Taking all AAUP cases together, of 46 cases reported since 1948, only 14 were adjudicated by a faculty committee. As Louis Jugan of the AAUP said in 1962, the general scene is certainly somber. There is only weak indication that the run-of-the-mill dismissal action will have in its history the one absolute essential, faculty review, for assurance that the faculty of an institution is charged with governing its own status and membership. Jugan, of course, agrees that the situation is better in the better institutions, including this one, worse in the weaker, poorer institutions. But nevertheless, there is no satisfactory definition of procedure in any institutions. Many of the most unfortunate cases have been those of non-tenure persons. Many of these cases are simply cases in institutions where there is no tenure system, and in those institutions you have a much higher incidence of cases. Otherwise, this pertains more to non-tenure persons in universities with a tenure system. Actually, tenure has little protection in law, as we know it, and while all too many smaller and poorer institutions still refuse to develop a tenure scheme, tenure, in fact, has stood as a fairly strong bulwark, though not always in defense of academic freedom. But quite apart from dismissal for reasons other than those offered, and reasons which, though false, are usually accepted, it is still the fate of non-tenure persons to be harassed by administration with little or no recourse at this university, as well as at others, by means of excessively elaborate review procedures devised by the administration, as was the case at Berkeley, which the administration lost, as much as by an arbitrary denial of normal treatment in regard to step promotions particularly. History is underground here. The situation here is not spread out for us on the books of the AAUP Bulletin, where most non-tenure people facing harassment find it expedient to accept defeat in silence. Again, there is a vacuum to be occupied with open, honorable methods. In the academic world, few of us even think of assuming the existence of normal procedure, complete with clear, explicit charges, orderly prescribed hearings with the help of counsel, and impartial judgment. Most of us find it difficult to imagine ourselves in need of it. It is reasonably clear that constitutional law should not and cannot provide the recourse for the growth of more than a portion of academic freedom, but it seems reasonably clear as well that over the long run, the academic community must generate a fuller repertoire of self-regulating procedures than it has been able to do so far, even in the best of institutions, not simply in anticipation of the inevitable recurrence of another wave of external pressure, another McCarthy, but in fulfillment of its own ideal of itself. Why it has not yet done so is a question I will pass tonight. John J. Chapman had a harsh enough explanation for it many years ago. It's amusing enough. The average professor in an American college, he said, will look on at an act of injustice done to a brother professor by their college president with the same unconcern as the rabbit who is not attacked watches the ferret pursue his brother up and down through the warren to predestinate in horrible death. We know, of course, that it would cost the non-attacked rabbit his place to express sympathy for the martyr, and the non-attacked is poor and has offspring and hope for advancement. The non-attacked rabbit would, of course, become a suspect and a marked man the moment he lifted up his voice in defense of rabbit rights. But I do not think we can identify the rabbits and the ferrets quite so easily today, if in fact Chapman was being completely fair to the colleges of his day, which I rather doubt, at least in some cases. All of us can think of some of the many inward inhibitions and outward obstacles that have delayed the emergence of a truly normal, customary, trustworthy academic due process, which does not exist. Here it is easy enough to recall the need. Now I would like finally to suggest what seems to me the issue more important than that of defending an expanded definition of academic freedom for both students and faculty. I mean the issue of how the university might more fully actually fulfill its purpose and hence, most likely, incite more academic freedom cases than we now face. But in so doing, affirm the truth that, after all, there is no measuring the strength of academic freedom or of anything except as it dares to challenge opposition. Institutions like People flourish when there is growing demand for their services. And the modern university in America is in no danger on that account, as perhaps no one has described more clearly than President Kerr. Government and business, the bastions of organized power in our society, have in the last 25 years come to demand knowledge of the veracity that rivals the heyday of 19th century veracity and the exploitation of the minerals of a continent, and labor unions are not far behind. These consumers provide a market that will indeed impel the sort of unprecedented growth the planners for the University of California and for universities in states across the nation now envision. Although it might, none of this need entail suffocation or constriction of academic freedom, but none of this interest of business, government, and labor in the university is likely to stimulate academic freedom. What troubles some people about President Kerr's prophecy is that it suggests the domination of some sort of more and more completely closed, integrated organizational system, which can still be called society, presumably, though it will not be the society we have usually thought of. In all decisions of social policy, that is to say, the first priority in policy will be to service this great system and keep it running. And that is, prophecy suggests in turn that the servicing of this system will be the first priority of the university. Chancellor Murphy is going to talk next time about the relation of the university to the community at large, and will undoubtedly touch upon this point. It is of the utmost interest that a man of President Kerr's background should explicitly suggest and tacitly welcome a new bohemianism in private life as compensation for the psychic costs of loyalty to such a system. But it is hard to see the university finding morale for a new autonomy in contributing to this bohemianism. Of course, the traditional hardcore of the historic university, the scholars training their young duplicates, can and undoubtedly will persist, perhaps even better sheltered by constitutional law and academic due process than now. But this would be to collaborate in a resignation from significance in society that even the somewhat tenuous older justifications for pure research and academic freedom tried at least to maintain. It seems that if academic freedom is to signify the growth of a vitality that counts for more than the survival of a caste of scholars talking to scholars, it is up to the university to do more than become the muldiversity in response to the needs of business and government. And to do this, it very much needs to rediscover how it can speak for itself, both to itself and to the rest of the country. In some ways, the saddest thing to reveal itself in the troubles within the University of California last year was the sense, usually diffuse and sometimes petty, but all too often heartfelt and hurt, of betrayal that various groups within the community felt respecting other members. The president plainly felt betrayed by the students. Some of the faculty felt betrayed by the president. Some of the students felt betrayed by the administration, and several regents backed off in rigid suspicion of everyone, administration, faculty, and students alike. Good faith was called into doubt. Considering the standards of responsibility usually applied in all of those organizations where men exercise power, I think the Byrne report was right in tracing this situation ultimately to the regents. They had the power. They had not been willing to share their power. Hence, they could not and cannot fairly be argued to be other than more responsible than those to whom they had refused power. And again, the Byrne report, it seems to me, put the situation very well. The crucial power of the regents is the power to reinvest in others, the high faith placed in the regents by the people. This suggests that the regents can and must show the same faith in the individual members of the academic community that the people of California have shown in the regents, and must accord them the rights due to responsible citizens in a free community. The wise use of power requires its wide distribution. This suggests that the regents must be willing to delegate their enormous powers as the people have been willing to delegate theirs. But ultimate responsibility is not sole responsibility. It means simply that those ultimately responsible can frustrate everyone's long-range plans for change for the better if they remain jealous of their status. And in addition to regential responsibility, the modern university, best embodied in this university, must clearly solve the problem of the status of the administration better than it has been solved. This is by no means to imply that the solution consists of reduction of the role of the administration. It is to suggest that administration cannot see itself simply as the arbitrator between all interests, both within and without the university. Administration cannot see itself simply as the honest broker. And this is the role that, whether mistakenly or not, came to seem to many the gist of President Kerr's conception of the university president. While I cannot say, despite being a loyal alumnus of the University of Chicago, that I see in Robert Hutchins all good things the university president might incarnate, Hutchins does suggest a different style that might still work to good effect in the multiversity. As to the faculty, the significant emotion inspired last year appears to have been, at the least, some chagrin over a long indifference to anything but the pursuit, under rather excellent conditions of academic freedom in this university, of the traditional scholar's work. The faculty was awakened to realize it did not comprehend the rest of the university. And the implication here is not that the scholar should give up some of his scholarly work in order to spend more time teaching or to spend time administrating. It is rather that the scholar agree to open the way for an expansion of the work of the university, partly perhaps along such lines as suggested by Christopher Jenks, but perhaps even more profoundly by an expansion of scholarship. I mean here to point directly at the fact that scholarship is not a disembodied activity of disembodied men, but a perfectly comprehensible expression of specific sorts of men. And bluntly, university scholars do not include a diverse enough array of minds. University scholars do not include enough different kinds of people, at least in the areas that are relevant to my concern here tonight, ours tonight, at least in the humanities and the social sciences. President Kerr is, I think, quite right, and many of the faculty took umbrage at President Kerr for this, but I think he's quite right in commenting upon the guild nature of professional scholarship among American scholars and academic men today, and upon the isolationist mentality of the scholars' guilds. Granted that government, business, politics, journalism, the arts, and various reform movements compete successfully for the sorts of minds I have in mind, and granted that no part of the university must lose its identity to any of these, that faculty need not become journalists, need not become businessmen, need not become politicians. Still, there is a way of construing problems in a fruitful scholarship that at the same time suggests a man, a scholar, sensitive to the modern world even more than to the standards of his modern guild. The strength of academic freedom, it seems to me, will be tested not so much by how well the university withstands the pleas, requests, bequests, demands, and occasional invasions of the larger society, whether it's the legislature in Sacramento, or big business, or big government, but by how well the university recruits to scholarship those who incarnate the point of the university having academic freedom in the first place. And again, I'd like to quote the Byrne Report in this regard, as it nicely expressed a view, once again, that is in fact very, very old. The university is established by a wise society to be its continuing critic. But while in principle we all welcome criticism of our established habits, in practice most of us resent it. The task of a modern university is to open the eyes of its constituents, and indeed of the whole world, to new possibilities. In other words, its task is not simply to meet the needs brought to it from business, government, labor. New possibilities, cultural and intellectual, social and moral, scientific and technological. A university which wishes to do these things is bound to attract a significant number of students, faculty, and even administrators, although that seems improbable, who are, as the cliche goes, people who think otherwise. Not only will they think otherwise, often they will do otherwise as well. A great university must, if it is living up to its responsibilities, attract many faculty and students who will choose to pursue paths that the great majority of people regard as silly, dangerous, or both. Such a university is bound to strain the tolerance of parents, taxpayers, and their elected representatives. And I might add here that a great university will include persons who will strain the tolerance of faculty and students as well. Taking this as an index, it seems to me hard to declare forthrightly that academic freedom flourishes in great strength today in the context that I am now discussing. It flourishes in its defense of the narrow interests of traditional scholars defined by the historic university. But it does not flourish in fulfilling this purpose of the university as the Byrne Report here sums it up. While I believe that on this point faculties must lead, and rather doubt that they will, it is also clear that the university, which is considerably more than the faculty, must recover internal coherence. It cannot be held together by money. It cannot be held together by administration. One of the proposals to emerge from the troubles of last fall was that ways be found by which the University Office of Public Information, and I'm quoting now from the report of the Academic Freedom Committee, might, in presenting the academic community, both to itself and to the public at large, serve more fully and more impartially all significant sides, even of a vigorous and complicated debate. This emanates from the condition in which newsmen were given by the University Office of Public Information a point of view about the controversy at Berkeley, which was exclusively that of only one participant in the struggle, and not that of the university as a whole, with the confusion, of course, that this one point of view was that of the university as a whole. And another proposal entered before the statewide assembly by the Committee on Academic Freedom read as follows: when a regent, and this might as well refer to any other member of the university, makes a charge against a member of the university community, some of you may remember the episode here, it should be supported by evidence and made in a form to which an answer or defense can be made, and with proper regard to due process. In these possibly minor but symptomatic proposals, we see reflected the tendency of the university community when it lacks coherence, the tendency of the university community in crisis to abandon its own identity and hence be unable to present an identity. On the one hand, in unseemly appeals by some members of the university to public forces outside the university, and on the other hand, in unseemly pretense by the Office of Public Information and by the UCLA Alumni Bulletin and various others, an unseemly pretense to the public that difficult issues were not, in fact, at stake. And academic freedom was touched by both, directly in the one case of the public attacks, indirectly in the other. In the United States, it's clear that these problems will be met within the structure of the typical university constitution, such as ours: no time need be wasted hankering after English and continental models of pure university autonomy. And it seems almost a formula, therefore, for American practice, that where the various elements of the university, trustees, administration, faculty, students, know how to get along with each other through having reliable, open channels available between each other, academic freedom has a secure base. And when they do not have such channels, even in great universities, academic freedom can suffer. Here I am suggesting that the key to the flourishing of academic freedom is internal to the university and not external, dependent upon the cycles of public passion, dependent upon the rise and fall of McCarthyism. If the university is successfully to make useful trouble for society, it must tolerate a larger, indeed the largest possible freedom for all of its own within itself. Thank you very much. I guess you can fire away at any point.
Professor, you mentioned reliable channels between the administration and the faculty and students. How do you feel about opening up the academic senate to students?
The way it's been told so far, I don't feel very good about it, because it seems to me to be presented simply as a kind of abstract principle. And it seems to me there is no abstract principle by which you can say that all meetings should be open to the press, so on and so forth. Some should be, some shouldn't be. I haven't seen the discussion yet that persuades me that the meetings of the Academic Senate should be. I'm open to persuasion, but I haven't seen them. All I've seen from the Bruin are, in effect, these abstract statements about democratic procedure, so on and so forth. It's simply not true that in a democratic society every discussion which touches upon the interest of persons is open to those persons. We all know this isn't so. And we all know, too, that people speak differently under different circumstances. And that there are times when you want to free people from the pressures or from certain pressures in favor of other pressures. It's not a question of being free from pressure when you're speaking in camera, but it's principle of being free and certain. It may be that the time has come that the meetings of the Academic Senate could be open. I myself feel that it was unfortunate that the meeting of the Academic Senate in Berkeley last fall was piped outside. It gave it a necessary aura of circus and exposed the resolutions of that meeting to the slanders that they suffered, namely that they were taken under a kind of Roman circus condition. But as I say, it may be that given other arrangements, it should be. Clearly, many decisions are made in the university that should be open. That's my general point. I don't think the Academic Senate meetings are that crucial. But clearly, a great many decisions are made, and they should be made from now on strictly in the context of the legal tradition which grants universities the right to regulate student conduct in terms of the right of the university to protect its own status. Nothing more, nothing less. Contract law should be abandoned, and all other considerations should be abandoned. And therefore, it can be argued, I think, that all regulations should be subject to full open discussion in the name of the university's educational purpose. So, if you're pointing to a principle, of course. But if you're pointing to a concrete case, the Academic Senate, I can't yet see it. Yes?
Professor, would you comment on the control by the federal government of knowledge produced by professors on campuses with the use of federal money?
I don't know enough about it. I have no immediate knowledge of that particular issue. The only experience that I've had that's at all related may not bear upon what you're asking at all, and that is the policy that the University of Chicago once pursued, it may still pursue, of requiring that all patents result of the research work of professors at the university be taken out in the name of the university and not become the possession of the professor himself. And there was some talk about extending this even to royalties upon books written and so on and so forth. This made a great many professors terribly unhappy, of course. And it seems to me, I cannot come up with an answer in principle because I can't myself feel that a policy of this sort would be worth the heavy bureaucratic invasion of earnest, simple, hard-working professors who write a book that earns them a couple of $1,000s. On the other hand, when it's a question of a scientific invention, a scientific advance on which a patent is worth millions and millions of dollars developed with university resources, then there's an argument. I think the same thing would pertain to the federal government.
What I have in mind is a prohibition on publication of new scientific knowledge, not the monetary ownership.
Well, my position here was shaped by a conversation with a friend of mine about 12 years ago who happened to be a brilliant mathematician. He was 30 years old and he felt his career was over because he had solved a problem that mathematicians had never solved before, and he knew that mathematicians did this regularly and then rusticated for 35 years. So he knew a bit about the way certain kinds of scientific minds work, particularly the intuitive kind, and he insisted that the security program, which at that time, of course, was in full ferocious force, made no sense whatsoever to scientists, and that the only rational policy for the United States to follow is to complete free enterprise, throw everything wide open, let the Russians come over and buy bombs if necessary, so that there was no rationale he could see for suppressing any information. I stand with that. I see nobody who has ever suggested otherwise, as far as I'm concerned. So it seems to me deplorable. And obviously it has tangential relations to academic freedom. And it's here that clearly, it seems to me, a point I didn't go into tonight, it seems to me that what will never come to pass, should come to pass, namely university professors should organize a union and recognize their status as employees. They confuse themselves, of course, with ordinary professionals such as doctors and lawyers who themselves have, of course, a very tough association. But they'll never be able to make any progress on this with regard to the government until they have this collective force. So it's one of those things. Some people would say it's purely tangential, however, because there is no clear line drawn on the publication of findings when the publication touches the status of various institutions. The university has its rights to regulate for its own existence. So also in all law, including the law of academic freedom, does any government. Any government has a right to protect itself. Academic freedom has never been argued to violate these rights of survival on the part of institutions. So that would be the line that would be taken to defend it, defend this practice. But it seems to me deplorable.
It can be concluded that one of the major positive roles of the university is to recruit scholars. This, of course, will bring about varying issues depending on the nature of the student body in any particular academic community. If we can assume that academic achievement and personal intellectual evolution is dependent to some degree upon some form of discipline, this brings about some other problems about personal positive role of the university, and I think the University of California has brought these forward. For example, not only the non-registered student, but the students who want to eliminate classes, to eliminate grades, to eliminate examinations, not to eliminate professors. If you can see, for example, that the guilty speech movement represents a dreadful anti-climax, and yet all of this might be argued to be also a climax to the liberal views taken by Hutchins and by Chicago generally, which has also been illuminated to a high degree in Chicago, brings forth the issue that if requests for scholars, there also has to be a certain degree of strain and tolerance of both students and professors. But where does the strain and tolerance end? That is, isn't there also some problem of testing good faith of the students?
Seems to me the strain on tolerance ends, at least in principle, where Martin Maley of Berkeley has recently said it ends. He's spending too much time worrying about students' problems because the students keep, insisting upon having faculty in on these things. He wants to go back to his research. Seems to me perfectly right. The university, it seems to me, has in history a reasonably clear definition of its nature as well as its purpose. And I myself am not persuaded that there are any truly defeating problems in this area you talk about. The faculty is in no danger of being coerced by students who want to give up grades and lectures and all the rest of it. If the faculty wants to lecture, it's going to. I don't see it's a real question, in short. And if students feel frustrated, then they are really not presented with inhibitions that touch upon their academic freedom, their constitutional freedom, or any other kind of freedom, so far as I know. They are simply frustrated, and they have perfect freedom to do something about their frustration in ways that are appropriate. And those appropriate ways, of course, don't include coercing anybody else. They can go out and buy a tent, which they probably should do. Paul Goodman will come lecture to them. I'd like to have Paul Goodman here, but we won't get him here, so let him be invited there. And I think, you see, the point I'm making is a little different than the one that's traditionally made, namely that what's wrong, you see, is some lapse of interest or attention on the part of the faculty to students. There may be such, although I don't think it's nearly of the sort that this implies. I think the difficulties are much more in the nature of bureaucracy. That is to say, quite concretely, it takes so much labor to push through anything like a reasonably simple reform that nobody wants to try it. If you were able simply to try out, some idea when you wanted to try it, then all sorts of things would happen. No, my point is that the break with the isolationist tradition of scholarship should be generated within scholarship itself, and can be generated within scholarship itself by picking up some of the lines suggested in the Byrne report, seems to me, and perhaps also by I hope, a natural growth in scholarship, as it presses on the part of some scholars against the guilds, you see, against the activity there. I don't think that that basic energy from any other source than that of the scholars themselves will have nearly the meaning that would have. Yes?
Professor, could you comment a little further on possible?
Well, are you stressing the question of the role of students in this process? Is that what you're asking?
Well, it has been suggested that there is sort of a reciprocal possible system of exchange of ideas between faculty and students, which might lead to evaluation of these things, which shouldn't be decided by the students, but as it were in consultation and exchange of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have in mind, in asking that question, the established faculty person of today, like myself, for instance, then I would have to say that it seems to me fruitless and bootless to explore very much along the line, of some sort of joint consultation, exchange of ideas, all the rest of it. Because the typical established faculty person is fully self-charging. He doesn't need any help from anybody else or any suggestions from anybody else about spending, his time, or indeed twice his time, on what he wants to do. He won't thank you for putting these extra impositions upon him, so on and so forth. If he's human, he'll hope very much that a lot of people will be interested in overhearing his work, you see. And that's part of what teaching is, it seems to me, for this sort of person. If he's not human, he doesn't care. But in any case, he's self-charging. Now, that poses the problem, then, that I've suggested and that others have suggested. What is there in university for the student who simply is not going to become such a person? The medieval university trained young men to become like their professors. And I'm arguing that to a considerable extent, this is the definition of the university associated with academic freedom. This is basically what happened. That the professors trained young people to become their own duplicates. And this is associated with a non-democratic tradition. That is to say, that's why I use the English case, you see, that the English universities radically have failed to democratize themselves. Much more so, they've failed more so than not simply the United States, but other countries as well. The number of English graduates in the population is shockingly low from our perspective. But it fulfills this tradition that the universities train people in their own image. This is no longer true. It hasn't been true for a long time with the appearance of the co-eds, this is obvious, and it's increasingly less true for a larger and larger proportion of the male students. All right, what are they supposed to get out of these self-charging faculty men who are all wrapped up in their work, and legitimately so, it seems to me? That's the point of a suggestion like Jenks's or others too, that it's entirely possible that the traditional faculty has to, in a sense, agree to open the university, here defining the university as, say, the faculty for convenience here, to open it more generously. And this may, in fact, you see, lead to the appearance in universities of high scholarly repute of non-scholars, and this, of course, always suggests to everybody the split between, those who teach and those who do research, or the split out of the University of Chicago. They split it into the university and the college. In the college, you had all the hard-working slaves doing the teaching all the time, and the great research men were up in their offices doing what great research men do. which I know very well and which I affirm very much. I like to do it, and I'm not for a minute, you see, defending this side of more teaching, less research. I don't mean to be confused with that position at all. It may mean that. It may mean a split faculty. On the other hand, it may in fact mean an involvement of the scholarship that is actually going on and the teaching of that scholarship by the scholars with the students in a different way. It's hard to suggest what it might be because it's hard to be sure in pointing to concrete cases. Thus, one doesn't want necessarily to point to the more bizarre experiments in American colleges for examples, Antioch, for instance, and Black Mountain, and so on and so forth. But as Jenks would suggest, as Paul Goodman has suggested, as many others have suggested, there is a great deal that could be tapped in the community by way of inspired teaching and informed knowledge that the traditional scholars don't have by, in effect, calling in professionals of another breed for part-time work. After all, what traditional scholars do cover is a narrow range of life, and it seems to me there's nothing in principle against the evolution of a situation in which the traditional scholars and these people will, in effect, fuse into a still coherent single faculty. This will raise all sorts of problems, of course. The point I'm making here is, of course, that it will come eventually to break down the fairly rigid standards of the guilds that we now have. By guild, I mean MINE, American Historical Association, Political Science Association, Modern Language Association, so on and so forth, in which all sorts of highly technical and ingrown standards of competence come to be the all in all for the scholar in his career, which don't relate to anything except to the other guild members. So that this is the isolationism that President Kerr is worried about. It seems to me that along this line, you can see possibilities. I can see the line opening up fairly well in English departments, for instance, in the area of all sorts of writers. It can certainly be opened up, as UCLA already has opened it up, in the departments concerned with the arts. And I see no reason why it shouldn't be opened up much more widely in all of the social sciences, which might save sociology, for instance, from its suffocation in the dust of methodological anxiety, all the rest of it, and psychology too. These opportunities for, call it exchange if you want, call it the expansion of scholarship if you want, are there. And they aren't going to fit the old molds, but that's part of my point. That if the academic man persists in defending simply the old mold, he's simply going to find himself a relatively small part of the expanded faculty of the multiversity, very well protected and probably rich, because he can't help but benefit from the general inflation of the whole university, but meaningless, a caste of mandarins, in short, and surrounded by those who are, in effect, servicing the needs of the system. It's to escape this. And I think that by definition, to escape this means to break down the guild of scholars as we have known it in historic university. And my argument is that under these conditions, academic freedom will become more important and more vital, because it will in fact mean more contact with more sensitive areas than we now are in contact with. More concretely, to bring up an obvious theme, to put it in a way that would suggest what I have in mind. Today, of course, we know from, say, the comments of Taylor and others that I read, that a major preoccupation of, say, 10% of the students, the activists, is the civil rights movement, which means Negroes. And Taylor tells us, and others tell us, the Berkeley faculty tell us, that we faculty don't know about this. You see, we've all of a sudden been awakened, alerted to this fact. And it's true, because when we were the same age, there was no such issue. And we didn't make one. I mean, I'm not going to go into all this, but in any case, that's the relationship. What seems to me to be the issue is not that the faculty get into close relationships with student activists in the civil rights movement, that the faculty find faculty who are involved in the civil rights movement. In short, if you want to put it quite concretely, American faculty should obviously include a great many more kinds of people, including activist Negroes. That the university should do something directly, actively, and specifically to train them and recruit them and bring them in. It shouldn't sit around passively and think that it's being noble by, hiring an obviously brilliant Negro when he comes along. That's nothing. Anybody can do that and is doing it. And it should fertilize itself thus in this way, and this will guarantee that contact that I'm talking about. Because as everybody knows, in most of the social sciences, there is in fact this kind of contact between the scholarship and living questions. You see, this is in no way a threat to scientific objectivity. There are certain scholars who still talk about scientific objectivity, but most of them don't know the arguments that it doesn't exist, and don't know the arguments in favor, you see, of commitment of one kind or another as a foundation of method. So that taking the civil rights issue, the traditional way it's been conceived is that the faculty should get close to the students and learn from the students. I don't think that's the answer. I just can't see it that way. I think the faculty should see to it that it has Negro activists on the faculty, just as it has all sorts of other kinds of activists on the faculty too, as well as Negroes who are physicists and don't give a damn about the civil rights issue. I mean, that's not the point, you see. Don't try to force Negroes to be activists. But the point is, get the point of view that we are now told we lack and is to be found among the students in the faculty. And this, of course, is something quite different than the traditional way of looking at it. And it seems to me meets the real issue, that the danger that academic freedom is simply going to become the defense of a caste of mandarins. And, insignificant. Defended by all sorts of noble phrases and arguments, as to the eternal value of truth to society, so on and so forth. But increasingly sacrificed to, the obvious immediate imperatives of issues as they arise, such as, the whole Vietnam thing. Is that at all to your point or not?
Well, it's pertinent, but I had in mind more specifically the possibility that academic freedom can be considered also the right to learn. And if such a right is to be made meaningful, is it time, as Dr. Taylor suggested when he was here, to reconsider the structure of the learning role that a student, an undergraduate, say, is in that he is forced to spend so much of his time in pigeonholes of various areas and not getting a broad feeling of any of them, and also dissociating one thing from another. And for example, if the grading system were very much revised, such as a pass-or-fail system, or pass-or-fail outside of the field of major interest, so that a student could explore an area that is very meaningful to him and simply qualify in areas such as foreign languages and other things which he should, as an educated person, have but need not excel at in order to be good in the area of his interest, and in order to be therefore free to really learn, to really explore things that are meaningful rather than what is funneled to him to be funneled back into the exam. And that is the sort of thing that I feel that the faculty could learn from the students what the student position is without taking dictation from the students, but to reevaluate the whole thing.
Well, I'm inclined to, on that point, to disagree to this extent, that instead of going through the painful process of trying to learn from the students, the faculty should simply support the policy of giving the students absolute freedom, or at least absolute freedom in most of the contexts that you suggest. So that, and this would solve most of the problems that frustrate everybody, that commits us to the grades and the unit system and all this incredible mechanism that is fundamentally a testimonial to the power of IBM machines and so on and so forth, and very little else. You could, for all important matters, simply have tests waiting for anybody who felt they were ready to take it on the German, and on the calculus and all the rest of it. When they're ready to take it, come in and take it. And how they go about learning it is up to them. The faculty will guarantee that it will appear at certain hours and talk about certain things. And if the faculty itself agrees among itself that now and then it would like to ask Buildings and Grounds for the space to conduct a program for 150 students, say, covering 5 eras of civilization, it can do so and not be attacked by a region as Marxist, that sort of thing, as happened at Berkeley. Mr. Pauly said they're Marxists, or if they're not Marxists, they at least believe in Marxist philosophy, or if they don't believe in that, they at least don't believe in capitalism. And this is the point about, you see, the Academic Freedom Resolution. Incidentally, to pick up a little point that I didn't put in, why I'm not quite sure, about the rabbits and the ferrets, what happened to that resolution proposed before the Assembly by the Academic Freedom Committee was that it was submitted, debated first, and then this last year came before the statewide Assembly and was tabled. They couldn't bring themselves to ask the regents for some sort of apology for this sort of thing, which may be wise, of course, because obviously the point now is to moderate feeling, soothe tempers, not provoke, not inflame. The exasperating thing about all this is, of course, that this necessity not to provoke and inflame is always on part of one party and not the other. This is, of course, the itch, you see, in the way American universities are constitutionally organized. You don't face this in English universities. Although the University Grants Committee in England now is getting to the point of running all English universities, and so the same thing will come up there. It seems difficult to understand the problems in educational policy, or philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, that would militate against something like this, at least on an experimental basis. If you don't want to start it tomorrow for everybody, why not start it for a class, the entering class, or start it for a certain number of people? Absolute freedom and a radical simplification of the testing process, so that perhaps in your first year you take one test and you've gone, to lectures by 15, 20 people, so on and so forth, and you yourself, as a student, have managed to sort of organize a kind of an impromptu group of one kind or another. Perhaps with the assistance of TA, we could have roving TAs, and every quarter or so, faculty could, be a roving figure for part of his assignment, that sort of thing. So he's free to move around too. I don't see why it wouldn't work great, and I can't be persuaded that there's anything in the sheer size of the institution that wouldn't allow it. Granted that a lot of people would have to plan, but God knows that's what they're doing all the time anyway, and the result, you see, today is the opposite, more and more of the lockstep. And the quarter system is going to be worse. We have lots of idealistic announcements of how this occasion of the conversion of the quarter system has caused us all to rethink our courses and refreshen the curriculum. Hasn't happened. Yes.
I wonder if you were doing away with apprenticeship skills for graduate education.
No. Any more than I'd do away with apprenticeship in carpentry or anything else. If you want to be a scholar, you've got to apprentice yourself to scholars. What other way? No, very little will happen to graduate education. This will go on, and it will go on for eternity, I hope, the same way it was going on, say, in the 13th century. Some things must be stable in our universe. Yes. Pass legislation to get control of the university? Well, this would be a revolution because, of course, what this would take would be a change in the California Constitution, and before this happened, the ground would shake. I don't think that the influence of business, labor, industry, so on and so forth, government, will ever take that form. Try for what? Well, they could. All one can say here is that the university should behave like any sensible animal in the world, that all animals try to aggress, protect their territory, get more. So the university should not be naive about these dangers. I think everybody is alerted to them. The difficulty is, of course, that one of the best techniques for success in this competition is seduction. A great many people inside the universities can be, of course, seduced by. It's not a question, of getting control or yielding it or losing a struggle. It's that it's so terribly valuable to be associated. And President Kerr's basic tactic, evidently, in defense against this is a classic one, and that is, of course, the balance of power. You don't really worry about the possibility of certain parts of the university or the multiversity getting too deeply entangled in business or labor, so on and so forth. What you make sure is that if there is an element entangled in labor, there's also an element entangled in business, and so on and so forth. So that it all balances off, you see, the great juggling technique. And that's terribly valid, not only in this case, but in so many cases of politics and other areas too. So it shouldn't be simplified. Of course, there'll be that tendency. But I don't think that again, it's nearly as crucial as, that is to say, it doesn't seem to me to suggest any serious threat to the capacity of the university to, in effect, reform itself if it wants to. What I'm talking about could happen without running into the problem of federal money having too much influence, government contracts of one kind or another, business connections, so on. The danger point would come once this sort of a university, which would become more radical, began to be understood. But by that time, it would be in a strong position to protect itself. Any others? Yes, sir. Well, I think we should all try to look forward to the day when people will behave in politics, for instance, not on the basis of their class or their sex, so on and so forth. That the population of the state of California, so far as its voting is concerned, its party behavior is concerned, will break down into whether you're a junior college graduate, a state college graduate, or a university graduate. If it does, then the University of California is in trouble, and that's one of the reasons that the administrators are so anxious to get as many people as possible into the plan. That's why they're not amenable to the suggestions of others that the university remain small. Because if it does remain small, then sooner or later we're going to have that collision that is, I think, going to come anyway between the state colleges and the university. For a very simple reason, that the state colleges have gained a higher and higher quality of faculty, many of them coming from perfectly respectable Eastern schools, where in many cases they work with graduate students. And these faculty, while charmed by coming to California for a few years, sooner or later wake up to the fact, I'm not getting graduate students, I never will. They're, scholars in the traditional sort, even out in the San Fernando Valley. And they are going to bring the kind of pressure that cannot, for the long run, be resisted inside an institution like the state colleges without the institution eventually going one way or the other. It'll either have to disintegrate back into something much less than what they are now are, or it'll have to become something much more. And this will, of course, violate the master plan that was so carefully drawn up in order to protect the privileged position of the university. My assumption is that sooner or later everybody will be going to college, and as it should be, because economists tell us that if you're only a high school graduate, your economic value is about that of a computer. And so if we want people to be worth no more than computers, why, we don't try to get them all into college. But I think as a society we're clearly committed to the idea that people are worth more than computers, and if we mean it, then there's only one thing we can do is educate them all. So these figures are minor, and so we shouldn't worry about the problem of numbers as we do. We should simply assume that the numbers are going to explode everything, and new ways will come. Thank you very much for coming in the ring.